Hello, I'm Michael Gilligan with Seek Common Ground. Welcome to our Learning Community Talk with Dan Vallone, the U.S. Director of More in Common. We have the privilege of having our board member and an American history and government teacher, Nate Bowling, join us to interview Dan and to discuss More in Common's American Identity Project research and grapple with our current state of affairs. Dan and Nate's bios are being placed in the chat, as well as a link to More in Common's research. So at the run of show, Dan will start with a presentation, and that will be followed by an interview that Nate will conduct with Dan. We're recording today's session, and we'll make today's talk available on our website by the end of the week. Also, at the end of Dan and Nate's discussion, we'll head to overtime for the second half hour and have an off-the-record discussion that you can join in. With that, I'll hand it over to Nate.
Thanks, Michael. I'm Nate Bowling, and I'm a social studies teacher here in Abu Dhabi, and also a member of the Seek Common Ground board. I'm happy today to join you today, and I'm really thrilled to have Dan in this conversation. More in Common's latest research has been fascinating and thought-provoking, and I think it's really important as we consider our fate as a nation. Dan's going to start with a brief presentation, and then I'll interview him at the bottom of the hour, and we'll have, again, like Michael mentioned, an informal kind of overtime afterwards. So stay on for the overtime, and there we'll incorporate your questions and comments into our discussion. All right, over to you, Dan.
Great, thank you, Nate. Thank you, Michael and Sandy and the whole Seek Common Ground team. Really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and dive right in. I want to be respectful of everyone's time here. So I'm the U.S. Director for More in Common, and I'm going to cover our American Identity Project findings, and then looking forward to the conversation with Nate. As Nate mentioned, there's a lot more research on our website. I'm going to do a very brief overview of some top-line findings, but encourage folks to please check out the full reports on our website. All right, so for some context, More in Common, I lead a 501c3 nonprofit based here in the US. We're part of an international initiative with teams in the UK, France, Germany, and as of this summer, Poland. And everywhere we work, we do public opinion research to understand issues of identity, polarization, division, and democracy. And then we work with a range of partners to apply our findings to build more cohesive societies that are able to advance a healthy democratic process and culture. We're probably best known in the US for a report that's called Hidden Tribes, a study of America's polarized landscape. In it, we used a unique core beliefs methodology to segment the American population into 7 profiles that I'll cover in the next slide. The inputs we used to segment people were based upon survey questions that they answered that drew on these 5 categories from social psychology. So group identity, perceived threat, attitudes towards authoritarianism, moral foundations theory, personal agency and responsibility. And so I'm going to be sharing data today using these 7 unique profiles listed here, what we call the Hidden Tribes of America. And these segments all come from those underlying worldview differences across Americans. So we didn't use demographics or political identity as an input variable. So we're trying to understand people's underlying psychology. And quickly here, you can see 7 different segments. Progressive activists, the most politically active liberal segment of the population. They are very white, well-educated, higher income. Traditional liberals are an older liberal group, much more pro-institution relative to progressive activists. They're also much more likely to have a warmer view towards conservatives than progressive activists. Passive liberals are much less likely to vote, much less engaged in civic affairs. High proportion of women in this segment, high proportion of communities of color in this segment. When you press on their views, they have pretty strong liberal views, though they interpret them primarily through the lens of family and immediate situations. Politically disengaged, biggest segment, 1 in 4 Americans, very diverse segment. It is a very racially diverse segment, young, lower education levels, very weak ties to civil society. Politically disengaged Americans very rarely vote or participate in civics. Moderates are kind of your old school middle ground kind of Americans, Rotary Club members, etc. And then we get into the two conservative segments, traditional and devoted conservatives. Traditional conservatives have slightly warmer views towards liberals, and devoted conservatives are the most politically active conservatives in America today. They hold the warmest feelings towards, for example, former President Trump. So these are the 7 segments I'm going to use as I dive into our American Identity Project findings. So first things, American identity is a very salient identity for most Americans. Over 3 in 4 say it is important to them. And you can see here in green, those saying very important. So devoted conservatives, 92% say it is very important to them. You can see kind of the average American, about half says it's very important to them. And we've shared this to just underscore that this is a very salient framing for a lot of Americans. And you can see that progressive activists and passive liberals, it's a much less important identity relative to others that they hold. And so we wanted to share this as context to anchor the data that follows. We're also operating in a landscape of division today. So when I asked to describe the country, you can see the descriptors that Americans are most likely to choose: divided, chaotic, intolerant, racist, rigged, weak, etc. All negative qualities. There are the positive qualities, and we gave them positive qualities to choose. We're very rarely selected. So we have a landscape of distrust and division. And Americans are convinced that that division and danger comes from within. So 8 in 10 say that the greatest threat to the US is internal as opposed to external. And progressive activists, traditional liberals, passive liberals, and devoted conservatives, it is 9 of 10 or higher. So very much convinced that this is the threat is in the country. So now we turn to history and how it connects to our identity today. So here we ask about the need to more publicly acknowledge wrongs committed in the past. And you can see that about 6 in 10 Americans agree that we do need to do more to publicly acknowledge them, although fairly intense polarization across the 7 segments. So only 9% have devoted conservatives, for example, and 97% progressive activists. So you can really see the intensity of ideological identity playing out on those 2 segments in particular. But again, by and large, most Americans feel like, yes, we need to do more to acknowledge the wrongs committed by earlier generations. At the same time, we find that that sentiment has nuance behind it. So when we ask about the risks of lingering too much on past atrocities, for example, and I kind of agree that too much is an interesting framing, and that can be interpreted in lots of different ways. But our interpretation of this data suggests that although there is greater willingness and interest in more public acknowledgement of wrongs committed in the past, there is widespread variation in terms of how much more and what does that constitute. And you can see here that lingering on too much on the past is very strongly felt by more conservative segments, and it's a more mixed feeling among the kind of moderates, passive liberals, et cetera. And then here we wanted to see how people felt personal connections. And so we asked, historical injustices have had almost no effect on my life, good or bad, and then how do you agree with this? I would just point out that about 50% of the country, 54%, so it's about half and half, would agree that they've had no effect. Interestingly, the segment that is most likely to disagree are progressive activists. And I just flag that because, again, they are a predominantly white segment. And granted, historical injustices could speak across many dimensions of identity. And I think that's what we're seeing play out in the data. And we are also seeing agreement with the prevalence of things like structural racism. And so you can see that the more conservative segments are much more likely to agree that historical injustices have had almost no effect on their life. And then it's more mixed as we look at the passive liberals, politically disengaged moderates. So now we looked at family stories in America, and we wanted to ask about familial experiences in America because oftentimes the American identity is framed in a very abstract way. And so here you can see down below, we framed a variety of different ways of explaining people's story. A story of working hard, passing on to the next generation, better life, search for opportunity. And what we found, I think this is encouraging, a lot of agreement. I'm showing the data broken out by race in this context. If we were to look by party ID, for example, we would see a lot of agreement. And at the same time, as the data shows here, there are stories that are felt most acutely by particular groups. So for example, over 3 in 4 Black Americans agreed that a story of exclusion, discrimination, and abuse resonates with their family's experience in America. That sentiment is felt by only about 1 in 3 white Americans, and only by 4 in 10 Americans overall. So we have both common stories at the family level, and we have particular stories at the family level. And now we get into kind of how do we teach history? How do we talk about history? What should we be learning? And so again, framing that there is more common ground than we probably anticipate or we perceive in the current debate. So 7 in 10 Americans feel it's important to teach the history of racism. There is, as you can see in the agreement scores, variation along ideology. So only 45% of devoted conservatives feel this way, although I should note that a number of them, 19%, are neutral, right? So the disagreement is actually lower than, it's not 55% disagreeing with that. So you can see that 100% of progressive activists agree with this. So there is an intensity disagreement, but overall, most Americans say this is important. And then we get into kind of how do we observe and celebrate history, in particular history where we're trying to elevate and dig into issues of race, identity, and belonging in the country. And so here we're showing a warmth scale towards national holidays. So if you feel very warm or very positively towards a particular holiday, you would give it a higher score. So the takeaway on this slide is that by and large, most holidays are fairly warmly felt by most Americans. The average score shown in that diamond are north of 60% for most holidays, with the exception of Columbus Day and Juneteenth. And here you can see that Republicans feel much more warmly towards Columbus Day relative to Democrats, and Democrats feel much more warmly towards Juneteenth relative to Republicans. Here's the same data shown by breaking the data out by race. And so you can see that, for example, Martin Luther King Jr. Day and Juneteenth, Black Americans feel much more warmly towards those holidays relative to Americans of other races. Although again, on Martin Luther King Jr. Day, it's still north of 60% more or less across the board. And so you can see that when we break the data out by race, Juneteenth has the greatest variation. And although Columbus Day has the lowest average score overall. And now we want to take one final step to zero in specifically on a period of history and how we should understand it and what is the Americans' current orientation towards it. So here we're showing agreement scores with the statement, the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s advanced the values of freedom and equality in my country. And again, you can see top line findings, 77% of Americans agree with that. And there's very little variation across political ID or race on that finding. But now we ask about familiarity, for example, with some of the personas who we might associate with the broader civil rights movement. And here we're breaking the data out by race. And what the takeaway from this slide are a couple of things. One, you can see that there are certain individuals, Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, who have entered the public memory, right? North of 80% of Americans across the board say they're familiar with Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks. When we look at other figures like Ida B. Wells, for example, much lower average. So only 1 in 4 Americans say they're familiar with that, with Ida B. Wells, for example, with large variation. Again, north of 60% of Black Americans being familiar with all of these figures across the board. So it underscores for us, and we'll get into the next slide, that although there is high level of normative agreement that the civil rights movement advanced freedom and equality, and people feel very warmly towards holidays like Martin Luther King Jr. Day, which are meant in some ways to commemorate this, there's not much depth. So when we ask folks to list out the 5 most important events of the civil rights movement, most could not name 5 events. And you can see that in general, their memories go towards Martin Luther King, the I Have a Dream speech, Rosa Parks, Brown v. Board of Ed, Selma March, but then those memories kind of trail off, and there's most say, I don't know. And finally, speaking of collective memories, we asked, what do they associate the civil rights movement with? And so you can see here, nonviolence, sit-ins, civil disobedience, and boycotts all have north of 50% in terms of Americans associating them with the movement. And then the broader kind of other themes or features, riots, obstructing traffic, for example, are much less a part of the broad public memory. So again, this was just our way of trying to explore how we understand history and how we see the connections to America today. You know, very eager to dig into the conversation with Nate now, and again, encourage folks to look at the website for the broader array of research.
Dan, thanks for that. That's really illuminating. A few questions. I'm wondering, what advice do you have for policy advocates, and what do you think are the implications for your work and research, given the polarized political environment we have today?
Yeah, it's a really important question. I think our data underscores a few things. One, there is more common ground, even on topics that are perceived to be very divisive, such as how do we teach and learn history. There is more commonality than we perceive. And I think what it underscores for us is the importance of building broad coalitions to elevate that more nuanced orientation towards history that most Americans, or a much larger percentage of Americans, feel, in order to help actually organize communities to make progress on how they teach and learn history in a way that is inclusive, accurate, and helps students process today in the history in a better way. And so again, it underscores for us that there is an intense disagreement. You see that across the slides, but more Americans are probably in a space where they want to see greater recognition of past injustices. They want to see that be part of how students process history, and they're willing to have a lot of discussion and dialogue about how do we do that in a thoughtful manner.
Yeah. What do you think that the hidden tribes model misses and leaves out, and gets wrong about this moment in U.S. politics and this moment in U.S. culture?
Yeah, thank you. So we've thought a lot about what does our model miss. There's a few things. One, the politically disengaged, 26%, we really actually should break that segment up. There's multiple dimensions of that, because if you were to probe into that segment, for example, you would find that there's a slice of that segment that has the strongest attachment to national identity. This is American identity is their only elite identity that they have, and they have a very strong feeling towards this. They react very positively towards very nationalistic claims, and so that's a slice of the politically disengaged. Another slice of the politically disengaged are much more critical towards the American story. They feel disconnected both from the present and from the past, and so how we would engage and mobilize the politically disengaged, for example, would actually vary significantly depending upon which slice of that segment we're talking about. So that's one thing that we think the model doesn't accurately capture and actually kind of misses in the current moment, because we've seen the politically disengaged demobilized, for example, in the 2016 presidential election on both the left and the right. The second thing that I think it misses, the degree to which passive liberals, for example, it gets really well that agency is a very salient variable when we think about why do people engage in politics. And so, for example, Knight Foundation did a really interesting study called 100 Million, where they looked at irregular or non-voters. And what they found that aligns well with our findings of passive liberals is that oftentimes people feel like they don't have enough information, they don't have enough power to involve themselves in the process, and so they don't get engaged because of an issue of agency. I think that what we don't always capture well in the model is how that might change depending upon issues. And so I think, for example, right now, our data would suggest that passive liberals are mobilizing around opposition to restrictions on reproductive rights. And so its agency is both a broad psychological phenomena, but also there's specific issues where suddenly someone might show up in a different way and might engage in the conversation in a much more active sense.
Interesting. I'm wondering, so I'm a teacher, so I want to be taught for a little bit. Teach me a bit about how various identities have been activated at various points in history. I'm thinking in particular about how in American society, change often comes in big bursts. So how have some of the identities been activated at various times?
Sure. And so More in Common launched in 2017, actually, in Europe, in response to the rise of nativist populist groups across Europe. So this was, there was a Syrian refugee crisis, and a lot of folks were doing polling, looking at why, how can we understand what's happening when these nativist groups are taking power across multiple countries, and what can we do to counter that? And what we found, to your point, change activates people's identities in different ways. The underlying condition that I think we have to zero in on is fear and threat. So what we know from psychology that when people feel a sense of threat, they tend to retrench inward to identities that they feel the strongest sense of solidarity with. That's a natural reaction to a certain degree. It can be conditioned and accelerated by conflict entrepreneurs. That's what we see playing out. humans also have a very pro-social orientation, though. So under the same conditions, you can see people reach out to those who are different and bind together in a sense of solidarity. And so what we saw in the 2015, 2016 time period was people's national identity being activated, but in a narrow way. I would also say the same kind of phenomena. So the Syrian refugee crisis, and I would say crises of movement of people more generally, also activates a humanistic identity in a lot of folks, typically folks who are more left on the ideological spectrum. But what we find interesting is when you have the same experience of fear, you do see in our typology, progressive activists and traditional liberals, for example, feeling even more pro-welcoming refugee and migrants, right? So there is something happening in terms of what identities are being activated. I think in the US history context, and I'm actually really eager for your thoughts, Nate, as a history teacher, but I think we can clearly look back and see when racial identities were activated with a lot of intensity, right? The 60s and 70s with segregationists running on white identity platforms in an explicit way. Obviously, earlier periods in the 20s with the Ku Klux Klan, with Reconstruction, you can see periods where people were very intentionally trying to prime and activate in that context a white identity in order to the civil rights movements of their time.
Yeah. You actually steered the conversation in place I want to go next. I'm always struck. I was struck when I saw it the first time and when I saw it this evening for me, afternoon for you all. The way in which we collectively remember the civil rights movement and the way it actually unfolded and the way that people reflect on their feelings during the civil rights movement and the way people actually behaved, the gap between how we collectively remember the civil rights movement, what do you think are the core causes of that? And then also, what are the implications of that for people who are like fighting for progress and racial justice today?
Yeah, we've been doing a lot of study on collective memory because it just has such a powerful influence on how people respond, right? And memory is always imperfect. Our team of psychologists always reminds us that memory is wildly imperfect in many, many ways. But what we can see here very clearly at work are a few things. And I think there's positive elements that are positive and negative elements that are both in place. So first, a very intentional elevation of a particular story about the civil rights movement, very centered around Martin Luther King Jr. and his "I Have a Dream" speech and his vision for the nation, and that being elevated as part of like the national canon to a certain extent. That's why the agreements, the warmth feelings are basically the same towards Martin Luther King, towards Rosa Parks to a certain extent. So you can imagine that across history books, across popular television, a similar story was told to multiple audiences of Americans. And again, I think there's an element that's positive. That's good that has been embedded in the national consciousness. What it very clearly obscures, and probably here we have both intentional and unintentional factors at play, it obviously obscures a much more complex story where it minimizes to a certain degree in certain contexts the opposition that the civil rights movement encountered. It reduces the degree to which Martin Luther King Jr. was seen as radical in his time, that he was, again, if I think the polling, as limited as it was, he did not have anywhere near the numbers that he has today, right? And that gets lost as kind of as part of this narrative. And so it makes it more challenging, I think, for contemporary activists because they can't harness a common story that would connect their struggle today, which tends to be much more polarized, with a struggle that is perceived as essentially American by most people, right? And so you can definitely see that at play in the data.
Yeah. We've seen the last two election cycles that political polling has been spotty at best on national issues, and particularly along matters of like race and identity and matters of racial tension. So when I look at the data you present, I nod my head at it. But how do you reckon with that issue that, like, in particular, when it comes to matters of race, polling of Americans has been spotty over the last couple election cycles?
Yeah. So I think one, we always, even as a group that does a lot of public opinion research, we always want to be very cautious in what we extrapolate from the data. Polling is even in the best polling, it's an imperfect instrument. And so I would say what you'll see in all of our reports is a large amount of qualitative research as well. So for the first half of this year, we stood up and engaged an online platform of 275 Americans, broadly representative of the country across politics and race and age. And that's always where we start. We start with qual as a way of saying, like, what are we hearing? What are people actually telling us? And then can we formulate a survey that allows us to explore how that phenomena shows up at larger scale? So I think one thing is we always want to get back to how do people actually experience this and tell us in their own words and framing. The second issue, and I think this is an ongoing process for us, is, so for example, the voting patterns among Hispanic populations, right, which a lot of pollsters missed in 2020. It underscores for us that the category that is conventionally used, Hispanic, right, obscures a lot of differences and aggregates people who have very different perspectives and backgrounds. And so for us, the challenge is where and how do we weave together a race or ethnic identity alongside of a broader kind of like core beliefs methodology, because we did a segmentation in Texas, for example, and we identified a segment that was 60% Hispanic, but very different had a very different orientation than other majority Hispanic segments. And we saw that play out in the election, where you see education level and class might be one of the driving variables, where folks who are slightly more working class are shifting a little bit more to the right. But it also speaks to, like, what is their family story? Where's the context from which they're trying to, like, start in terms of what they see government's most essential role, right? And so it's an ongoing challenge. I don't have a great answer to it, but I think that our model of trying to figure out ways to weave together more complex profiles gets us a little bit closer to trying to see what the reality on the ground is actually like.
No, that's helpful. No, it's a super nuanced thing. And like, you all are pouring through a lot of data about a lot of variables, and it makes sense. We're running a bit short on time, so I'm going to go to our Proust questionnaire closing question. Who is somebody who has been influential to you, and why?
I did not anticipate that question, so I appreciate it. Well, someone who's been very influential to me was, so I started my career in the Army. I was an Army officer. And so in my first unit, we had a senior operations officer. So he's probably 10 years older than me,
sure,
much more experienced. And he really influenced me because he was the consummate professional. Like, he was an incredibly good officer, very good at his job, got a lot of things done, like definitely a good operations person. At the same time, kept his human side very strongly. When he transitioned out of the unit and we were doing a farewell ceremony, we were in Afghanistan. He almost started to get choked up talking about how our job was to serve and support the soldiers out on the front lines. And it was very moving, I think, for all of us there. And it was a reminder that, again, even in the context of the Army, which is very hierarchical, leadership involves flipping that, right? Your job is to serve and support those who are out there more often putting themselves at risk. And so the ability to be both an incredible professional and a truly moral person, I think, was the example that he provided for me.
That's awesome. As somebody who spent from 1997 to 2003 in the Air Force Reserves, as enlisted men, I appreciate that story a lot. Dan, thank you so much. For folks who are on right now, we're going to continue to the overtime session. But Dan, I just want to say one more time, thank you for coming on and having this conversation. We'll continue off the record in a moment.
Great. Thank you, Nate. Really appreciate the chance to speak.
Yeah, thank you.